What if everything you believed about your family was a lie? Imagine a single mother struggling to survive with her hungry child when an unexpected act of kindness from a stranger changes everything. This isn't just any story. It's one of the most shocking black-voiced dramatic stories you'll ever hear. Stay tuned to discover how one man's grief and one woman's desperation collide in a life-altering twist. Subscribe now, like, and comment below if this story moved you. Sandra sat huddled in the corner of their small, dimly lit room, the air cold enough to make her breath visible. Julia, her 2-year-old daughter, lay on the thin mattress beside her, whimpering softly in her sleep. The girl's face was pale, her small frame trembling from hunger. Sandra's heart broke each time she saw the pain in Julia's eyes. She couldn't remember the last time they had a proper meal, and the thought of her daughter suffering was a weight she couldn't carry any longer. The room was silent except for the faint dripping sound of the leaking faucet. Sandra stared at the cracked walls, her mind a whirlwind of desperate thoughts. The old coat she wore, once warm and functional, now hung from her shoulders like a lifeline, offering little protection against the cold. She hadn't been able to afford a new one in years, and even if she could, the money was too scarce to think about luxuries like a warm coat. She glanced toward the small kitchen area in the corner. The refrigerator door was half open, and inside there was barely enough to feed a mouse. The sight of the empty shelves twisted something deep inside her. She opened the fridge completely, looking inside one more time, hoping, praying for something more. But there was only one thing left, a shriveled apple. It looked pitiful, almost as if it had withered from the weight of her hopes. Her stomach growled loudly, a cruel reminder of how far she had fallen. Her hands shook as she picked up the apple, inspecting it before sighing heavily. It wasn't much, but she could at least cut it in half for Julia. Maybe she could even find a way to make it seem like a treat, to mask the truth that it was all they had. But Sandra couldn't do it anymore. She couldn't live like this. Couldn't watch her daughter wither away while she failed to provide. She couldn't watch Julia go hungry, not when there was a world full of people who lived without this pain, people who had more than enough to eat, to give. Her thoughts darkened as the weight of their reality crashed down on her. She hadn't even realized how badly she needed help until she saw the apple in her hands. It was like a slap in the face, a reminder that she was failing her daughter, a single mother alone without any support or resources, no one to turn to. And all the while her daughter looked up at her, waiting for some kind of miracle that Sandra had no idea how to create. A sudden burst of emotion hit Sandra, and she couldn't hold back the tears any longer. She sank to her knees, the apple falling from her hands. "God, please," she whispered to the empty room, as if the walls might offer her some solace. "Please, I need something, anything. I can't keep doing this to her. I can't do this to myself." The room seemed to close in around her, the coldness biting at her skin, making her shiver uncontrollably. It wasn't just the physical hunger that tore at her, but the emotional weight of it all. She was drowning in poverty, in shame, in despair. And yet she couldn't stop trying to keep going, for Julia, for herself. But it felt like it was never enough. It wasn't enough to just survive. She needed a way out. She needed to do better. Wiping her eyes, Sandra stood up, taking one last look at her daughter, who was still asleep, clutching a ragged teddy bear. She couldn't bear the thought of failing her. The thought of continuing to live in this cycle of hopelessness made her sick. But there was no way out, no other options. She had tried everything, small jobs, odd errands, but nothing seemed to work. She was stuck in a constant loop, and with every passing day the weight on her shoulders grew heavier. Then, without warning, an idea struck her. It wasn't much, but it was something. If she had to beg, then she would beg. She had no shame left. For Julia, she would do anything. Sandra grabbed her coat and pulled it tight around her, stepping out of the apartment into the cold, biting wind. The streets were empty, the city cold and indifferent to her struggle. She knew this path wasn't one she would ever want to take, but what choice did she have? The entrance to Maison de Lumiere was a sharp contrast to the streets outside. Warm, bustling, filled with the scent of gourmet food and the sound of laughter. Sandra hesitated, feeling out of place, but she knew she had no other option. She had to ask for food. She had to do whatever it took to survive. As she entered, the staff didn't even look up. She felt the weight of their indifference, as though she were invisible. She made her way to an empty corner, where she stood with her hands clasped in front of her, trying to look as small as possible. Then a man approached her. His suit was crisp, his posture stiff, and his eyes held a quiet sadness. Donald Lacey, millionaire, philanthropist, and a man who had lost everything. He saw her before she saw him, and something about her, her posture, the way she held herself, the tired eyes, struck a chord within him. The pain, the despair, it was all too familiar. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice gentle, yet tinged with sorrow. Sandra flinched, feeling the sharp sting of her own pride. I was hoping for some food," she said, barely able to meet his gaze. Donald looked at her for a moment, his expression unreadable. He hadn't expected this, but he couldn't turn away. "Come with me," he said softly. "Let me buy you a meal." Sandra's heart raced. The offer felt strange, almost surreal. A part of her wanted to refuse, to walk away from the pity she felt he was offering, but the hunger in her stomach overpowered her hesitation. She nodded silently, following him to a table. As Donald ordered, he watched Sandra as she looked at her daughter from a distance, her eyes filled with something he hadn't seen in a long time. Hope. It made him uncomfortable, but it also made him feel something else, guilt. Something about Sandra reminded him of his wife. It was the way she held herself, the way she put her daughter's needs before her own. This was not a chance encounter. Something deep within Donald's heart told him this was a moment that could change everything. The perspective of Donald Lacey, a chance for redemption. Donald Lacey stood silently at the edge of the restaurant, watching Sandra as she sat at the table, her eyes glued to her daughter Julia. His heart, which had been frozen in grief for years, stirred in a way he hadn't expected. The way Sandra held herself, her exhaustion, her vulnerability, yet the unyielding love she had for her daughter, reminded him of his late wife Rachel. It was uncanny. He had never thought of himself as a sentimental man, but in that moment, watching Sandra's quiet devotion, something inside him snapped. The ache of the past, the pain of losing Rachel and their daughter in that tragic accident 8 years ago, had never really left him. He had buried it, numbed it with work, with philanthropy, with everything that kept his mind busy. But seeing Sandra reminded him of what he had lost, and more importantly, what he had become, a man so wrapped in his own grief that he had forgotten how to truly live. As he walked back to his table, his mind raced. He couldn't explain why he was so drawn to this woman, a stranger sitting across the room in a shabby coat with nothing but the hope of a warm meal in her eyes. Was it pity? Maybe. Or was it something deeper, something buried inside him? A lingering need to make up for the emptiness that had haunted him for so long. Donald couldn't help but notice the way she looked at Julia, the way she gently brushed her hair back, her hands shaking slightly, but never faltering. Sandra wasn't just surviving. She was fighting, and that fight, that determination, it felt familiar to him. It reminded him of Rachel, of the way she had cared for their daughter, the way she had put everyone before herself. The waiter brought their food, and as Donald sat down across from Sandra, he noticed the way she hesitated, the wariness in her eyes. He could tell she wasn't used to accepting help. There was pride in her, even in the face of hunger, even in the face of despair. It made him wonder how long she had been living like this, how long she had been fighting battles no one could see. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice almost drowned out by the noise of the bustling restaurant. But there was something in the way she said it that struck him. It wasn't just gratitude. It was the relief of someone who had been given a glimpse of something more. A moment of respite in a life that seemed relentlessly bleak. Donald wanted to say something, something comforting, something profound, but the words stuck in his throat. How could he relate to her? How could he, a man who had lived in a mansion, for years surrounded by wealth and luxury, truly understand her struggle? And yet something in him compelled him to reach out, to offer more than just food. But Sandra, before he could say anything more, stood up abruptly, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. "I'm sorry," she mumbled, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. I shouldn't have accepted. I didn't mean to impose on you." Donald watched as she rushed to grab her things, her face twisted with shame. He felt a pang. Of something? Regret? Compassion? Or maybe it was guilt for not understanding her pain until now. He had seen so many people in his life turn to him for help, but none of them had ever made him feel the way Sandra did. None of them had ever reminded him so vividly of what he had lost, of what he still longed for. He stood up, following her, out the door, but she was already gone. Vanished into the snow, leaving behind only the fading imprint of her footsteps in the cold. For the next few days, Donald couldn't shake the image of Sandra from his mind. He kept seeing her in his thoughts, her eyes filled with gratitude and pain, the way she had looked at him as if she were carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. He knew he couldn't just let her slip away. He had to do something. But what could he do? He wasn't sure, but he knew that the hollow feeling in his chest wasn't going to go away until he acted. It wasn't until he found himself following her footsteps in the snow that he realized how deeply he was connected. To her, how deeply her struggle mirrored his own. But it wasn't just about his grief. It was about her. It was about the way she refused to give up, the way she refused to let her daughter suffer. When Donald reached her tiny apartment building, he stood in the shadow of the doorway, staring at the building in front of him. His heart beat faster as he watched Sandra through the window, singing a lullaby to Julia, the same lullaby Rachel used to sing. The connection was undeniable. He didn't know why he did it. Maybe it was because he wanted to see her safe, wanted to make sure she wasn't going to continue suffering in silence. Or maybe it was because, in that moment, he realized that the only way he could heal himself was by helping her heal. Donald placed the bag of food and essentials at her door, knowing she would never accept them if he left them in person. He needed to remain anonymous for now. He didn't want her to feel indebted to him, didn't want her to feel like she owed him anything. What he gave wasn't charity. It was a lifeline, and that was all he wanted to offer. Hope. The following days brought a change in the rhythm of Sandra's life. The anonymous gifts continued, small gestures of kindness that made her feel as though someone truly saw her, not as a beggar, not as someone to be pitied, but as a person deserving of care and respect. She didn't know who was helping her, but with each passing day, her resolve grew stronger. She began to believe that maybe, just maybe, life had more to offer her and Julia. But Donald wasn't done. Every gift he left behind brought him closer to a realization. He had been living in the shadow of his grief for far too long. Helping Sandra and Julia wasn't just an act of charity. It was his chance to heal, to start living again. One afternoon, Donald decided he could no longer stay hidden in the background. He had to reveal himself, to face Sandra not as a stranger, but as someone who genuinely cared. He could no longer hide from the connection that had formed between them. When he arrived at her door with fresh fruit, homemade soup, and a children's storybook, he felt both nervous and certain. This was the moment that would change everything. He knocked gently, and Sandra opened the door, her expression a mixture of surprise and hesitation. But when their eyes met, the silent recognition was instantaneous. It wasn't just about the food or the gifts anymore. It was about the beginning of something new, a chance for both of them to heal, to move beyond their pasts, and to face the future together. Donald had no idea that opening the door to Sandra's life would lead him on a path of redemption, or that their shared vulnerabilities would create the kind of connection he hadn't known he needed. But standing there in that moment, Donald realized that sometimes helping others wasn't just about giving, it was about finding yourself in the process. The storm brewing. It had been weeks since Donald's anonymous acts of kindness began. Every day he found himself drawn further into Sandra's life, more captivated by her strength, her resilience, and her unwavering love for Julia. The bags of food and essentials he left at her door had turned into more. Now he would find himself pacing outside her apartment, wondering if today was the day he would reveal himself, wondering if today was the day his feelings would overpower his grief. But with every moment he spent thinking about her, he grew more conflicted. His growing feelings for Sandra were undeniable, but they came with guilt. The last thing he wanted was to use his past, the tragic loss of his wife and daughter, as a way to connect with Sandra. He had been trying to heal, trying to find meaning, in a world that had once been full of life. But the more he helped Sandra, the more he realized how deeply he longed for something he thought he had lost forever. Hope, joy, a chance at a real future. Yet with every passing day, the line between helping her and wanting to be with her blurred. Was he truly helping Sandra, or was he simply using her as a way to fill the void that his loss had left? Could he truly separate his grief from his desire to be close to her? Could Sandra ever see him as more than a benefactor? And if he did confess his feelings, what would that mean for their fragile relationship? One evening, as Sandra returned from work, her tired body dragging behind her, she was startled to find Donald standing at the entrance of her building. Her heart skipped a beat. There was a quiet urgency in his eyes, a look of someone who had made up their mind. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, watching her with a strange intensity. Sandra's chest tightened. She had been waiting for this moment in some way, the moment when he would stop hiding, when he would finally step forward and show himself. But now that it was here, she felt a pang of anxiety. She had grown to appreciate his kindness, to feel the comfort of his presence, even if it was never in person. But she wasn't ready to confront the truth. What did this mean? What was he really offering? Was it charity or was it something more? "Donald," she whispered, her voice catching in her throat. "What are you doing here?" He stepped forward slowly, his hands clutched tightly at his sides. The distance between them felt vast, despite the proximity. There was a silence that hung in the air, heavy and thick, as if both of them were weighing the moment, trying to figure out what would come next. "I couldn't stay away any longer," Donald said softly. "I've been watching you, Sandra, helping you in ways I never thought I would, and He paused, taking a deep breath as if gathering his courage. "I've come to realize that I'm not just doing this out of pity. It's not just charity. I care about you more than I expected." Sandra felt her heart race. She hadn't prepared for this. She hadn't thought that he could possibly feel the same way. After all, he was rich, successful, worlds apart from the life she had come to accept as her own. And yet, here he was, standing before her, bearing his soul in a way that made her knees feel weak. "I've watched you, Sandra," he continued, stepping closer, his voice raw with emotion. "I see how you fight every day, how you put your daughter first, how you keep going even when everything seems impossible. I see you, and I can't just walk away from that." Sandra swallowed hard. Her mind was spinning. Her heart was telling her to believe him, to trust in what he was offering. But the fear of being hurt again gripped her. Her entire life had been one of survival. She had learned to keep people at arm's length, to never expect too much. And now, with Donald standing in front of her, offering something she had longed for, affection, love, safety, her mind rebelled. Was this real? Or was it another cruel twist of fate? Could she really trust someone again after everything she had been through? Donald watched her closely, waiting for her response. His eyes searched hers for any sign of reciprocation, but all he saw was hesitation, a fear that mirrored his own. He reached out slowly, his hand trembling ever so slightly as it hovered just inches from hers. "I know this is complicated, Donald said, his voice breaking slightly. I'm not asking you to make a decision right now, Sandra. But I needed to say this. I've spent years trying to shut myself off from the world. But then you and Julia came into my life, and I realized that I can't keep living like this. I want to live again. With you. Sandra looked at him, her chest tightening as emotions she hadn't known were there flooded her system. Part of her wanted to scream, to run away from all this, to protect herself from the vulnerability that was creeping in. But another part of her, the part that had fought to survive, to provide for Julia, could see the sincerity in his eyes. I don't know what to say, Sandra whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I've been living in this place for so long, trying to make sure Julia is okay, trying to keep things together. But I'm scared, Donald. Scared of trusting again. Scared of being hurt again. The breaking point. The silence between them stretched on as Sandra processed his words. Her heart was in turmoil, her thoughts a whirlwind of fear and hope. She had never let herself think about a life beyond survival. All of her decisions had been driven by the need to protect Julia, to provide for her. But now, here was Donald, offering her something more, something that could change everything. And the question that lingered in her mind was a cruel one. Do I dare take this chance? She took a step back, her breath shaky. I don't know how to trust anymore. I don't know if I can give you that, Donald. Donald's face tightened in understanding, but his resolve didn't waver. I'm not asking you to trust me right away, he said quietly. But I want to show you, Sandra. I want to show you that there's a future we can have together. A real one. Not just the survival you've known. You don't have to do it alone anymore. Her chest felt tight, her emotions threatening to spill over. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that there was a way out of the darkness she had lived in for so long. But her mind, that voice that had always kept her grounded in reality, was screaming at her. It's too good to be true. He's rich, he's a stranger, and you don't know him like you think you do. You're asking me to change everything I've built for myself, Sandra said, her voice trembling. Everything I've fought for. My independence, my ability to do this on my own. Donald's expression softened, and he stepped closer. I'm not asking you to give up your independence, Sandra. I'm asking you to let me help you, to let us build something together. I can't change your past, but I can help shape our future. Sandra's mind raced, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. This was no longer just about survival. This was about trust, about opening her heart again, about giving someone else power over her future. It was terrifying. But the connection she felt with Donald was undeniable. And for the first time in a long time, she thought that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to face this life alone. Her voice cracked as she spoke, the words coming out before she could fully process them. I'm scared, she whispered. But maybe we can try together. Donald's face broke into a smile, and for the first time in years, Sandra allowed herself to feel something other than fear. It was hope, a fragile new hope that she could finally begin to rebuild her life, to step into a future that no longer revolved around survival, a future where love could take root again. And as they stood there, facing each other, the storm inside them both began to calm, replaced by the quiet promise of something new. A future, perhaps, that neither of them had expected, but one they were both willing to face, together. The conclusion and the lesson weeks passed since that fateful moment, when Sandra took the first step toward opening her heart again. With Donald's unwavering support, she slowly began to rebuild her life. Not just for herself, but for Julia, too. The small apartment that had once been a place of desperation and fear was slowly becoming a home filled with hope, laughter, and new possibilities. Donald, too, was changed. The grief that had consumed him for years began to recede, replaced by the warmth that Sandra and Julia brought into his life. His mansion, once cold and silent, was now filled with the sounds of life. Sandra humming while preparing meals, Julia's laughter echoing through the halls. For the first time in a long time, Donald was living, not just existing. Together they worked on creating a new life. Sandra was no longer just cleaning Donald's mansion. She was making it their home. Julia thrived in this environment, and Donald's heart swelled as he watched her grow more confident and joyful each day. One evening, as Sandra and Donald sat on the couch, watching Julia play with her toys on the floor, Sandra turned to him, her heart full. "I never thought I could have this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "A family, a real family, and a future that doesn't feel so impossible." Donald reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "I never thought I could have this either. You and Julia brought color back into my life. You've given me hope in a way that I never imagined." The words hung in the air between them, quiet but heavy with meaning. For Sandra, it wasn't just about the material comforts of life. It was the safety and love that Donald had shown her. For Donald, it wasn't just about rescuing Sandra. It was about learning to love again, to find meaning in the connections they had built. The walls he had built around himself for years were finally coming down. The moment of joy months later, Sandra stood in the small garden outside their home, her hand resting gently on her growing belly. Donald stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders, watching as Julia ran through the garden, laughing in the sunlight. It was a peaceful moment, the kind of moment Sandra had never dared to dream about. Their lives had changed beyond recognition, but it wasn't the wealth or the material things that made their life complete. It was the love they had for each other, the bond that had been forged in vulnerability, in shared pain, and overcoming the deepest of fears. Sandra had come to realize that it wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about living. It was about finding a reason to hope again, to trust again. And now, as she looked at the life they had built, the future they were creating, Sandra knew that they had earned this happiness. They had fought for it. They had chosen to open their hearts to each other despite the fear, despite the wounds of the past. And it was the courage to love again that had brought them here, into this new, beautiful chapter of their lives. The lesson. A message of hope and healing. The story of Sandra and Donald is not just a tale of love. It's a story of healing. It's a story that shows how, even in the darkest of times, there is always a chance for redemption. Even when life feels impossible, even when the weight of the past seems too much to bear, there is always hope for a new beginning. The journey of Sandra and Donald teaches us several key lessons. The power of compassion. It is through compassion that we find healing. Donald's willingness to help Sandra without expecting anything in return, and Sandra's ability to accept help despite her pride, highlights the importance of empathy and understanding in healing wounds. The courage to love again. Both Sandra and Donald carried emotional scars from their pasts, but their ability to open their hearts to love again shows that no matter how much pain we carry, we always have the power to choose love, to choose healing, and to choose happiness. Resilience in the face of adversity. Sandra's journey from poverty to finding a loving family shows us that no matter how hard life gets, we have the strength to overcome. We may not be able to control our circumstances, but we can control how we respond to them. The importance of trust and vulnerability. Sandra and Donald's relationship was built on trust. Trust in each other, trust in the process of healing, and trust in the possibility of a better future. They learned that vulnerability is not a weakness, but a strength that allows true connection and growth. Call to action. Sandra and Donald's story reminds us all that love, compassion, and resilience can overcome the toughest of challenges. No matter where you are in life, no matter the obstacles you face, remember that there is always hope for a better tomorrow. If you've been touched by Sandra and Donald's journey, or if you've experienced your own struggles and triumphs, we'd love to hear from you. Subscribe, like, and comment below to share your thoughts, your stories, or to show your support. Together, we can build a community of strength, hope, and healing. Remember, it's never too late to start over. It's never too late to open your heart and embrace the love and healing you deserve. The journey may be difficult, but the reward is worth it. Let's keep the conversation going and let's inspire each other to live with hope, love, and resilience every day.